All right, then, econ friends, welcome back for another video in fiscal policy. In this short video, what I want to do is introduce you to the idea of what's called supply side economics. You may have heard this term before. We're going to cover it briefly in this video, and we're going to place it in the context of fiscal policy. Remember, again, fiscal policy is about federal tax rates and federal spending. Okay, it's about that tax rate and G. Let's jump into it and let's think through supply side economics. Now, to understand supply side economics, we first have to always, like we do in economics, take a step back and look at the conceptual framework that we're looking at. Historically, fiscal policy has been really focused on managing and stabilizing the economy through demand side policies. Everything we've done up until now with fiscal policy has been, increase G or decrease taxes to increase C and I. And again, we know our formula, our GDP formula, that Y, which is AD, which is aggregate demand, is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So historically, fiscal policy has really been focused and attentive to demand side policies, to policies that affect aggregate demand, okay, AD. However, there is a group of economists who advocate that instead we should be focusing on a different kind of fiscal policy, which they call supply side economics. Supply side policies, they focus on increasing the economy's aggregate supply. It's AS. Okay, so as the name suggests, supply side policies, they're going to focus on increasing the overall economy's aggregate supply, which can be defined as the total supply for all goods and services at any given price level. And we'll discuss AS in a lot more detail in our module on the ADAS model. Okay, but for now, understand that supply side policies, they focus on two things. Number one, increasing the economy's AS, and number two, increasing the economy's overall productivity. These theories tie in very much to what we talked about with economic growth. That economic growth is fundamentally a function of productivity. So supply side policies, they really focus less on the individual demand or on the aggregate demand and more on the supply side, on increasing the nation's overall productive capacity. What are some of the things that these policies do? Well, number one, supply side policies, they seek to reduce individual taxes. They seek to reduce business taxes. They seek to overall minimize the regulation of the economy, and they seek to increase government spending, but specifically they seek to increase government spending that is targeted to research and development, infrastructure, and job training, pardon me. Notice this, when we talk about our economic growth models, when we talked about economic growth discussion, we focused on a few factors that could increase economic growth for an economy. We spoke, for example, about the physical capital. We spoke about human capital. We spoke about the power of technology and really just general economic and business innovation. Take a look at what these supply side policies do. They want to reduce taxes, they want to reduce business taxes, they want to minimize regulation, but look at this government spending. The supply siders advocate government spending on research and development, on infrastructure, and on job training, which tie directly to physical capital, human capital, and innovation. R&D spending will improve your technology base and your innovation. Infrastructure spending will improve your physical capital. Job training for citizens, especially those who are unemployed, will increase human capital. So these policies are really all about stimulating the long-term growth prospects, the long-term productive capacity of an economy. Supply siders, they believe that their policies will promote greater long-term economic growth by stimulating income, savings, and capital formation. So that's the crux of those models. From the supply side lens, one crucially important variable is the marginal tax rate. And this is why this ties in. This is how supply side ties into fiscal policy, because fiscal policy is about tax rates. From a supply side viewpoint, the idea of the marginal tax rate is crucially important. In tax theory, what your marginal income tax rate is, so your marginal tax rate, that is the percentage of each additional or marginal dollar of income that you earn that is paid in taxes. So if, for example, you have a marginal tax rate of 30%, if you earn an additional $100 of income, 30% of that additional income is taxed, so $30, which implies that even though you earned 100, you only kept 70. On the other hand, let's say that your marginal tax rate was reduced from 30% down to 20%. If you made an additional $100 at work, maybe you worked some overtime, maybe you got a raise, whatever it is, you would only be paying an additional $20 in taxes, which means that you would keep more money in your pocket. So this idea of the marginal tax rate is critical in tax theory, and it's a critical component of the supply side viewpoint. Supply side advocates maintain that if you lower marginal tax rates, you're going to increase people's incentives to work, to supply resources, the factor markets, to use resources more efficiently, all of which will combine to increasing the economy's overall AS and its production capabilities. So that marginal tax rate is a critical concept to supply siders. One of the models that they've used, and this is sort of an advanced model, a lot of people dispute it, a lot of people like it, it's hotly debated, but I want to share it with you. One of the models that they use in supply side theory is what's called the Laffer curve. And the Laffer curve is basically a graph that shows the relationship between, number one, income tax rates, and number two, on the overall tax that the government will collect. So again, the Laffer curve is asking, at different tax rates, at different marginal tax rates, how much tax revenue will the government actually bring in? You see the curve here. You have on this axis tax revenue, which is the amount of money the government will bring in based on different tax rates. And you see down here the tax rate. Notice the two extremes. If the government were to set the tax rate at 0%, they would bring in no tax revenue because you would keep everything you earn, they would have no tax revenue. So here's one extreme case. But notice the other extreme case. At 100% tax rate, nobody would keep any of their income, so nobody would work. So at 0% tax rate, they bring in $0 of tax revenue. And at 100% tax rate, people say, hell with working, there's no income, so there's no income tax, and the government brings in $0 of revenue. So these become the two outlier points. And the Laffer curve basically sketches this graph. The big idea behind the Laffer curve is that there has to be, at some tax rate, optimal amount of revenue collected. In other words, people who advocate the Laffer curve say that since 0% gives you no tax revenue and 100% gives you no tax revenue, that there's got to be this graph with this peak up here, this highest maximum tax revenue amount. Supply-siders, pardon me, they say that their goal, one of their goals, is to find the specific tax rate that maximizes that tax revenue. Now, notice what this graph tells us. This graph also implies, let's go to red here for context, that if you're on this side of that maximum point, that raising tax rates will increase revenue. So if you're right here operating here in red and you increase tax rates, you're going to move up here and increase tax revenues. But now let's go to black, and let's say that in black you're on this part of the Laffer curve. Notice that in this part of the Laffer curve, if you increase tax rates, you're going to move down this way and you're going to decrease tax revenues. So one big implication of the Laffer curve is that it's critical that you understand where you are on the Laffer curve. Because if you're on one side versus the other side of this maximum peak, changing tax rates is going to have really significant impacts on the federal government's revenue. So one big implication, you have to know what side you're on. The other big implication is, even though this curve right here is drawn as a nice, perfect, symmetrical curve, which you would think implies that the maximum tax revenue is at 50%, that is not the case. It might be the case, but we cannot assume that the curve is a perfect symmetrical curve, and therefore the maximum has to be right here at the midpoint. In fact, the curve might be maybe skewed somewhere like this. So you get your highest total revenues at a higher tax rate. Some people think that the curve is skewed like this. So you're going to get your highest revenue at a lower tax rate. We don't know what that answer is. It's very, very big topic of debate, but it's critical that you understand, number one, what the Laffer curve is, but that the implications are. It's very difficult to know, but important to know the tax rate that maximizes those revenues. And by extension, it's important to know if you're on this side or this side of the curve, because based on that answer, policy changes in tax will have different effects and possibly unintended consequences. But still, this is a really critical idea that I wanted to share with you behind supply side theory. To wrap it up, summarize this, again, there's a lot of ongoing debate today in economics policy circles about, number one, the benefits of supply side policies. Some people love them, some reject them. Oftentimes people's political views influence that, unfortunately. Okay. There's ongoing debate about the shape of the Laffer curve. Is it perfectly symmetrical? Is it skewed to the right? Is it skewed to the left? And there is also debate about where the economy actually is on the Laffer curve. Are we over here in the red, or are we on this side of the peak in the black? Because that position is going to be critically important. So there's a lot of debate about it. What I want you to keep in mind after this lecture, what I want you to walk away with, is the big idea that supply side economics should not, really emphasize, should not be viewed as a short-term counter-cyclical tool. But rather, I encourage you to think about supply side economics and see its value as a long-term growth-oriented strategy that an economy can implement to, again, in the long term, increase its overall productive capacity, increase and sustain a higher growth rate, and in the long term, be better off. Thanks for your time, and I'll see you next time.